Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Right. So now we are studying Usul al-Fiqh. Now because I have taught you guys Usul al-Fiqh before, I am not going to explain to you the basic things. Right? So because we're doing Noor Anwar, we're going to be looking into more advanced things now. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So the science of Usul al-Fiqh started off from the days of revelation. So when the Quran was revealed, عندما نزل الوحي نشأ علم أصول الفقه هنالك. So Usul al-Fiqh has always existed in our tradition. It's not always been codified and written down, but it has always existed. Yeah, Usul al-Fiqh has always existed. So for example, like if we read the Quran, we know that the Quran, it uses language. Yeah, it uses language, Arabic language. So in the Quran we have things that are haqiqi, yeah, things that are majazi. So for example, like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says aqimus salata, aqimus salata. So if you look at the word aqimu, it means what? To make stand up, to make erect. So therefore, haqiqatan, it can't mean that. Because aqama yuqimu has to be with something that's tangible, like a building. Aqama al-bina. Yeah, you can't aqama as-salat unless you take the majaz meaning. Yeah. So this shows that usul al-fiqh was existent in the time of the revelation of the wahi. Or for example, like when Allah, He speaks in the Quran and He uses a mufrad, aqimis salata, and it refers to everyone. Yeah, and sometimes He uses jama, ya ayyuhal ladina amanu awfu bil uqud, jama. So all of these things, usul al-fiqh has always existed. And the reason why usul al-fiqh has existed is because the whole of the deen is based upon principles and rules, yeah, consistency. So in order for there to be consistency, there has to be rules. So for example, like let's say you drive on the road. On the road there has to be rules you have to abide by. You have to drive on the left hand side. You have to stop at the lights. You can't speed in certain places. When you park your car, make sure you don't park your car on the yellow lines. These are all rules. Why? Because if you want consistency in traffic, if you want people to be able to get on with each other, you have to have rules that people have to abide by. So that's why usul al-fiqh is something which has always existed. Then what happened was, slowly as scholars began to continue, scholars began to see a rule. So they began to write that rule down. Yeah. So for example, like they began to see a rule, al-khas, yeah, or al-am, or al-mutlaq, or al-muqayyad, or al-amr, al-nahi, al-khafi, al-zahir. So they began to see these rules and they gave them names. So it doesn't mean that they weren't there and all of a sudden these names came up. So usul has always existed, number one. Number two, scholars later on began to identify. So as usul were developing, as scholars were developing the usul, the whole point of the usul, like the word usul means, is from the word asal, which means the original. Yeah, like for example, when you build a building, the foundation that you build the building on top of is called a what? is called the asl. Yeah, the asl. And then whatever you put on top is called the far'. Yeah, the asl and the far'. You have a tree, the roots are the asl, and the rest of the tree is what? Far'. So the usul, it's like those things which govern the main things in Islam. What are the main sources in Islam? Quran. This is the main source. And then to understand the Quran, the Prophet ﷺ, he explained the Quran. And this was known as the Sunnah. And then those Sunnahs, or those Quran, those Sunnah, those rulings that were part of Islam, but not necessarily something that were mentioned in the Quran or Sunnah explicitly, but agreed upon by Sahaba. Yeah, they all did it. So it's called the Ijma'. Okay, so these are the main usul that we have, as we're gonna see. So the scholars, they took two routes when it came to usul al-fiqh. They took two routes. The Hanafis took one route, and the Shafi'is took another route. The route that the Hanafis took was that the Hanafis would look at the case studies in Islam. Yeah, they would look at what? The case studies. So for example, like, it's haram to eat pork, it's haram to drink khamr, it's haram to gamble, it's haram to kill, it's haram to do sajda to ghayrillah, and so forth. It's necessary to pray 5 times salat. A woman who is menstruating cannot pray her salat. A woman who is menstruating cannot fast but has to do qada. So they began to collect all of these case studies. Yeah, qadiyas. بدأ الناس يجمعون القضايا بشكل الأبواب الفقهية. So they started to put them into fiqh chapters. Yeah. So for example, like tayammum, where should we put this? Tayammum is to do with purification. Let's put this in before salat. Yeah, tahara. And what about eating lizards? Is eating lizards allowed? Hanafi say no, it's not allowed. Shafi say yes, it's allowed. Okay, where should we put this? Okay, let's put this in a chapter to do with food and drink. Yeah, al-ashriba wal ma'kulat at'ima. Where should we put rulings related to talaq, divorce? Yeah, etc. So they began to collect all the case studies and they started to put them into some order. Yeah. So then the Hanafis started to look at these and started to say, well, let's now start to try and derive some sort of background principles that these case studies are based on. Yeah, so they looked at tahara and they said, okay, what things break tahara? Okay, if you go toilets, like the Quran says. But what if you just go into the toilet, nothing comes out? Okay, then it doesn't break because the rule is something has to come out. So okay, what if some blood comes out from your, from your arm, you cut yourself? Okay, the rule is khuruj and najasa, and so forth. So they began to develop certain concepts. These are not usul, because these are rules, but they fall under more what we call qawaid and dawabit. They're called qawaid and dawabit, principles. Usul, like we said, deals with what? Usul deals with what? No. The Quran, the Sunnah, the Ijma', that's what Usul deals with. Usul does not deal with these things. These are a result after you've done the Usul. These are like later on. Yeah? So, when we have usul, when we have the usul, collected, yeah, we're dealing with not fiqh, we're dealing with the sources of fiqh, the roots of the tree we're dealing with. We're not dealing with the fruit on the tree. We're not dealing with the leaves, the branches. We're dealing with the roots. We're dealing with the foundation of the building. We're not dealing with the walls or the ceiling or the roof or the windows. What are we dealing with? So when we study usul al-fiqh, the Hanafis look at usul al-fiqh, they're looking at how do we deal with ayats of the Quran? How do we deal with hadith? And I gave you an example of how the Hanafis do it. The ingredients are like what? The Quran, the Sunnah, etc. The results that we want are what? The ahkam, fard, wajib, sunnah, mustahab, mubah, makruh, haram, halal. These 8 things. Those are the results. We have ingredients and we want a cake. The cake are the ahkam, yeah? The result, the final cake that you have in front of you. Those are the ahkam. The ingredients you start off with are known as not the usul. The ingredients that you start off, yeah, like the Quran, yeah? The usul is taking these ingredients and getting them to this. So when you get your ingredients and you know how to mix them together, you know how to add things together, you know how to take things out, you know what temperature to use, all this is usul. So the process from getting from the original, yeah, and getting to the end, this is called the methodology, is called the usul al-fiqh. So the Hanafis, they use this and they derive the usul, the principles, from these Quran, Sunnah, and so forth. Fahimtum? Okay. The Shafi approach is different. The Shafi approach is basically, you don't do this. The Shafi approach is, you look at what ilm is. Ilm. Ma huwa al-ilm? Ma huwa al-fiqh? What is ilm? What is fiqh? What is a hukm? What is a ruling? What is a mahkum? Who is a hakim? So they study all those things that are around the Quran and Sunnah. They study everything. So for example, like if you got a tree, they don't study the roots. They study things like, what ground can roots grow in? Yeah? What are the different types of roots that you can get? When do these roots grow nicely? When do they grow weak? That's what they look at. So they'll look at things like, what does it mean to be a Muslim? So when you have to say, you got to pray salat, but does everyone pray salat? And they say, well, you got to be a Muslim. So they look into the concept of being a Muslim, the concept of bulugh, age of puberty. Yeah, what is bulugh? What does it mean to be insane? If you're insane, you don't pray salat. Majnoon. What does it mean to be majnoon? What does it mean to be sakran, intoxicated? Yeah, so they look at all these things. Does that make sense? So their usul took a different approach. So these two usuls are taking 2 roads now. Imagine 2 roads. So the first 300, 100, 200, 300, 400 years, 500 years. In the 600 years, the 2 approaches, they joined together. Yeah, the 2 approaches met together. And these 2 approaches, they became one. The Hanafis took the Hanafi approach and the Shafi approach and they mixed them together. And the Shafi'is, they took the Shafi approach and the Hanafi approach and mixed them together. So most of the books of Usul al-Hadith that you get after the 600s are what? Combination of the Hanafi approach and the Shafi approach. Usul al-Shashi is predominantly the Hanafi approach. But usul and matn al-manar, yeah, is, as we're going to see, a mixture approach. Yeah, although in usul al-shashi there's also Shafi bits in there, but it's generally the Hanafi approach. But matn al-manar, the book that we're doing, this was one of the books that was written after this merger, and it was written by al-Imam al-Nasafi. Yeah, Matn al-Manar. And then came along many people, many Hanafis, and they wrote commentaries on Matn al-Manar. Many people came along. So Noor and Anwar, the book that we're going to be looking at this year, is basically a commentary of Matn al-Manar, which is combination of the two approaches. Yeah. So you have Matn al-Manar, which is the text at the top of your book, yeah, in the red, and then the rest of it is the commentary by the author that we're going to look at, inshallah. Yeah. So this is the approach of the usul over the years, yeah, the variation of the usul. Now, one thing that we have to understand is when we study usul al-fiqh, there is two benefits of understanding usul al-fiqh. Yeah, two benefits of understanding usul al-fiqh. Number one, the first benefit of understanding usul al-fiqh is we try to understand how the early mujtahideen used to think. How the early mujtahideen used to think. Understand that? So for example, like Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, when he was faced with hadith or a ayat of the Quran or a fatwa of a sahabi, how did he used to think? So usul al-fiqh, gives us an understanding. It's not 100% that this is how Abu Hanifa used to think, but most likely Abu Hanifa used to think like this. So when we look at the usul, we'll know, okay, this is how he derived it, most likely. This is how he found the approach. And like we said, the usul existed from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So for instance, like when the Prophet ﷺ was sending Mu'adh bin Jabal to Yemen, he said to Mu'adh bin Jabal, remember what he said?
Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. كيف الحال?
He asked him, how are you going to
Yeah.
rulings? And he said, first I'll look in the Quran, he says, then I'll look in the Sunnah, and then I'll look for statements of the companions, and then I'll use my own.
Very good, yeah. So بما تحكم يا معاذ قال بكتاب الله فإن لم تجد في كتاب الله قال فبسنة رسول الله وإن لم تجد قال فأجتهد برأيي. Yeah. So then the Prophet became happy and said to him, Alhamdulillah alladhi waffaqa rasul lima yarda bihi rasuluhu. So this was usul is teaching him. If you don't find it in the Quran, you look in the Sunnah. If you don't find it there, do ijtihad. And then Umar radiallahu anhu, he also had his usul as well. So he would tell his governors, he would tell them, if you're stuck with a situation, look in the Quran what the Quran says. If you don't find it in the Quran, then look what the Sunnah says. If you don't find it in there, he says, then write to me and I'll tell you. And if that doesn't work, then you do what you have to do. And Ali radiallahu anhu used to say, look in what the Quran says. If you don't find it in the Quran, look what the Sunnah says. If you don't find it in the Sunnah, he says, collect, assemble, bring ijma' al-alameen, bring the people together, yeah, and do mashwara with them, yeah, speak to them, see what they say. So collect the experts, speak with them. Then after that, if you can't find it, then do it yourself. So does that make sense? So that's the first benefit of usul. The second benefit of usul al-fiqh, studying usul al-fiqh, is that when a person becomes or trains to become an expert in fiqh, Hanafi fiqh, usul al-fiqh will sharpen their abilities. Yeah, it sharpens your abilities. So you'll know how to look at dalils. You'll know how to look at evidences, how to look at texts, how to look at different statements. Yeah, so these are two benefits of usul al-fiqh that we have. Okay, right. Any questions up to there? No? Right, so one of the big differences between this book and between Usul al-Shashi is that in Usul al-Shashi he simply explains the usul, nothing else. Yeah, and he focuses a lot on early Hanafi works. So sometimes he might say, as you remember, he might say قال الإمام محمد في جامع الصغير. Yeah. ذكر أبو يوسف في كتاب الخراج. Yeah, and he'll quote what they say to prove the asl. Yeah. So to prove the usul, he'll quote from those books. Yeah, you guys remember? In Anwar, he doesn't do that. So in Noor Anwar is what we call a mukhtasar. It's a matan. The matan of Manar is a matan. So it's a mukhtasar. Mukhtasar means abridged. And the aim of the abridged text is simply to condense all the information together. Condense it so that students can memorize it. So the aim of Matn al-Manar is that students memorize the text. Very short, as you guys can see. It's going to be a very short text, he's going to say. But the commentary is obviously long. People don't memorize commentaries. They memorize matans. So a long time ago, people used to memorize matans, they used to. Yeah, nowadays, people don't memorize anymore. Yeah, it's too hard now.
So this more red writing here is going to be matan, and everything else is just different.
Yeah. So the red writing is the matan, and the rest of it is the text, and underneath is the footnotes. That's just the hashiyah. So the text is called Matan al-Manar. Yeah, Matan al-Manar. Manar means from Noor. Manar means ism dharf, the place where the Noor comes from. So because usul is to do with part of the deen, yeah, so it's like the text of the light. Matan al-Manar. And Noor al-Anwar means what? The light of the lights. So this is like giving more light to the light itself. That's why he calls it Noor al-Anwar. Right. So we're gonna inshallah start with this text inshallah. Hopefully we're gonna start today. Yeah, reading it. But before we start, we say a dua. Yeah, we say dua because at the end of the day, ilm comes from Allah. We try our best, but Allah is the one that gives ilm. And we know this from Allah in the Quran himself. He mentions وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهُ. Have taqwa of Allah, and Allah, He teaches. Allah is the one that gives ilm. And the ilm that we want is al-ilm al-nafi', beneficial knowledge. We don't want ilm that's going to cause us to become far away from Allah. We don't want ilm that's going to make us arrogant. We don't want ilm that's going to make us believe that we're superior to everyone else, or That ilm that makes us debate with people for no reason. We don't want that kind of ilm. That ilm is ilm dar, yeah, harmful ilm, غير نافع. Yeah. What do you want? Ilm nafi. So we always ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for help and support. And when we study these books, we should always make dua, just like we should make dua for our teachers, we should make dua for the authors of these books. Because it's their efforts that have continued this tradition of ours. Yeah, this is, like we said in last year, if you remember, we mentioned about in today's times, the whole concept of preservation of Islam is slowly torn apart. So we have many movements out there, like liberalism, for instance, liberalism, modernism, and many other philosophical theories and approaches which are very contradicting with our usul. Yeah. So our usul is the only thing that stops people from distorting the Quran. If we take usul away, someone can take those ingredients and they can mix them anyhow they want and say, this is what Islam is. Yeah, you don't have usul, anyone can pick up a Quran, learn a bit of Arabic, and just say that aqimus salat, what does it mean? Okay, aqim means to stand up, and salat means dua. Alright, just do some dua, and that's it. MashaAllah. Yeah. Hudan lil muttaqeen. Muttaqeen means someone who shields themselves. So on a hot day, anyone who wears shades and wears a hat on their head and shades themselves from the sun comes under muttaqeen. Yeah. Why is that wrong? If you don't have usul, that's going to be right. So usul is very, very important for us. We have to keep this tradition going, because without usul, like we said, the whole of the religion can be distorted. And I always tell the students this. I say the most important lesson that you can study, the more important topic that you can study is usul al-fiqh. Why? Because if it wasn't for usul al-fiqh, then the whole universe would be destroyed. Yeah? If it wasn't for usul al-fiqh, what happened? Whole universe would be destroyed. Because if you don't have any usul, you can interpret the Quran in any way you want. And if you interpret the Quran in any way you want, people will not be living according to how Allah wants. And if you're not living according to how Allah wants, then people will, يَبْغِي بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. People are just going to transgress against each other, because they're going to make their own laws up, subjective laws. And once you make up your own laws, khalas, that's it. You destroy the universe, because universe only benefits if there's humans. If there's no humans, then destroy the universe. Am I right? Allahu Akbar, Subhanallah. Yeah. So this is why usul al-fiqh is very important. You have to study usul al-fiqh, understand usul al-fiqh. And this book isn't the epitome of usul al-fiqh. This is not like you study this book and you know all usul al-fiqh. No. Like I told you guys in usul hadith as well. The aim of this book is that we study this book and then we try to understand the approach, like one road of usul al-fiqh. We try to understand various approaches of usul al-fiqh, so we can make sense of the deen, of how different scholars. Because this book, this usul, this isn't 100% of what Abu Hanifa rahimahullah had in his head. It's not 100%. Most likely we're saying, we believe, this is the usul that he used to follow. Yeah? So once we understand this, then we can appreciate the other usuls as well, books that were written. Now, question did you have? Now, this is the next thing now. Why did scholars begin to write usul al-fiqh? Like, wasn't it enough just to have fiqh? Yeah. لماذا كلف العلماء أنفسهم بجمع هذه الأصول بشكل الكتاب ولم يكتفوا بعلم الفقه? Yeah. Why? So, Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah, in his time, there was a very big movement of hadith scholars. Yeah, the hadith scholars were very strong in their approach, and Imam Shafi was a muhaddith, because Imam Shafi rahimahullah, he studied under Imam Malik, and he was a Maliki, and he used to give dars according to the Maliki position. And from his famous teachers was also Sufyan bin Uyayna. In Makkah, he used to study from him. And Naam, hadith. And so he was a very famous muhaddith. And he studied fiqh under Imam Malik and also under Imam Muhammad. So Imam Shafi rahimahullah, he became a governor in Yemen, and unfortunately there was a rebellion taking place in Yemen. So Imam Shafi got caught in that rebellion, and he was brought to Baghdad because the Khalifa Harun al-Rashid had decided to kill him. He was a rebel. But Imam Muhammad rahimahullah, he stepped in and he intervened on his behalf. And Imam Shafi'i, he began to study with Imam Muhammad his books, and he studied all the Zahir Riwayah books and Ghair Zahir Riwayah books. He studied them from Imam Muhammad. And Imam Muhammad passed away in the year 189. And then Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah, he established, after Imam Muhammad passed away, he established the Shafi'i madhab in Baghdad.
So when he wrote a Kitab al-Risala.
Okay, so in the year 189 Muhammad passes away, and in roughly the year 196 he establishes the Baghdad, it's known as the Al-Madhab Al-Qadim Li-Shafi'i, which is the school of Imam Shafi'i, which he initially established in Baghdad. And the scholars say that if you read the Qadim, Al-Madhab Al-Qadim, if you read the Madhab Al-Qadim, the Madhab Al-Qadim of Imam Shafi'i is very close to the Hanafi Madhab. Very close. Then in the year 200, Imam Shafi'i, he went to Egypt. He moved to Egypt from Baghdad. And over there, he had many debates with students of Imam Malik, because he was a student himself. So he had many debates with the students of Imam Malik. And he began to revise his madhab. And he established a new madhab, which was known as Al-Madhab Al-Jadid. Al-Madhab Al-Jadid. You understand that? Okay, so then what happened? So then Imam Shafi'i passed away in the year 204. Okay, and his students, one of his famous students in his fiqh, because he has famous students in various things, but in fiqh, one of his famous students was Al-Imam Al-Muzani. And Imam Muzani was like Abu Yusuf in the Hanafi madhab. And Imam Muzani is the uncle of Imam Tahawi. So Imam Tahawi, who you're going to study maybe next year, famous Hanafi scholar, his mother's brother was Imam Muzani. Yeah. Anyway, so Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah, whilst he was in Baghdad, Abdul Rahman bin Mahdi wrote a letter to him and asked, can you please write down for us some rules about hadith, because the people of hadith are beginning to clash with one another. You understand?
Who was it that sent this?
Huh?
Who was it that sent this?
Muhammad Abdul Rahman bin Mahdi.
Who is Abdul Rahman bin Mahdi?
Abdul Rahman bin Mahdi is a famous muhaddith. Yeah. ibn Mahdi, one of the famous narrators in Sahih Bukhari as well, and Muslim and others. So he was in Basra. So he asked for what?
Rules of
Yeah. So Imam Shafi rahimahullah, he wrote for him rules, and he sent it to him. And these rules that he wrote down became famous, and it became known as Risala of Imam Shafi. Risala. So what was these rules? These rules were like usul, early usul of hadith and fiqh mixed. Later on, when Imam Shafi went to Egypt after 200, he revised the Risala again, and he changed many things in there, and he added many things. So the copy that we have today, the version that we have today that you can buy in the stores, and there's a good version that you can get, which has an addition, footnotes by a Sheikh Ahmad Shakir. Sheikh Ahmad Shakir was a famous Hanafi scholar of Egypt, has footnotes on his version, which is a copy that you can get. And this copy that you can get, this is the one that most places will give. So he changed a lot of things in there. Yeah. Point of all of this is that Imam Shafi was considered to be the first person who codified usul al-fiqh. Yeah. But he wasn't the first person to come out with usul al-fiqh, because why?
This existed in the time of the Quran.
Usul al-fiqh has always been there. Yeah, it's just been the need for making it in a book form was there. Everyone understand that? Yeah.
So when Imam Shafi wrote Kitab al-Umm.
When he wrote Kitab al-Umm. So Kitab al-Umm is written by his student. So he used to teach it and his student used to write it. He was written by his student Az-Za'farani, and this was written in Baghdad. Yeah, in Baghdad. And then later on, things were revised in there by others. Yeah. So, that was basically the madhab. Okay, we'll stop there. Any questions? No? Is it too much writing?
You said the second approach Imam Shafi approach was looking at not the